to Top-Down Consulting's encore presentation. Want to know how your project is progressing? Try Agile Scrum Methodology. Today's presenters are Michael Smith and Steve Densford. Michael and Steve will speak for about 45 minutes, and then they will turn things over to the audience for questions. You can ask questions anytime during the presentation by using the question box on the panel on the right side of your screen. And with that, I will turn things over to our presenters.
Thank you, Shanna. My name is Steve Densford with Starbucks Coffee Company, and I'm here with Michael Smith from Top-Down Consulting. And we want to talk to you today about Scrum and our experiences with Scrum. We're going to spend some time giving you an overview of the background of Scrum, kind of a little bit of a definition of what Scrum is. Also some examples of how we've had Scrum in action here at Starbucks and how it's benefited our EPM projects. And we also want to leave you with some thoughts and concepts that you can take with you to change your world, leveraging these principles that we'll talk about today.
Hello, this is Michael Smith.
All right, so we'll dive in and talk about a little bit of a background of what Scrum is. First of all, I'm going to start with the Agile Manifesto. Agile Manifesto is a kind of a unifying statement of all Agile frameworks. It describes the unique principles of Agile which differentiate Agile approaches from traditional project methods. There are some key things that we want to emphasize as you read this slide. It's where we really emphasize the things that are on the left: individuals' interactions, working software and solutions, customer collaboration, and responding to change. Doesn't mean that the things on the right are not important. It just means that we really value the things on the left more. As I mentioned, Scrum is one form of Agile. Others you may have heard of are Lean, Kanban, XP. Scrum was created initially by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland as a better way of building software, and in essence, delivering software solutions. And they have an original definition that's in the Scrum Guide that I want to just read you briefly, which is: Scrum is a management and control process that cuts through complexity to focus on building software that meets business needs. Management and teams are able to get their hands around the requirements and technologies, never let go, and deliver working software incrementally and empirically. Scrum itself is a simple framework for effective team collaboration on complex software projects. So the analogy they use of a Scrum is just like in rugby, which is really based upon the team concept and the philosophy that team focus is vital, that a self-organized team is best suited to deal with complex business problems, and that when a team is given objectives instead of tasks, they establish their own tactics and achieve excellence. There are three aspects of that empirical process that was in that definition that I read to you. Three pillars, we would say: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency is the process, establishing that the process has to be visible to all those that are responsible for its outcome, so stakeholders, team members, whomever they may be. Inspection means that we look at that process for undesirable variances to the goals of the team, and adaptation is taking action to adjust and reduce variances to acceptable levels going forward. And those three principles have a strong interplay that result in increasing improvements to the overall process. So we'll see those empirical process pillars at play in the Scrum framework as we talk through this. So this here is a picture of the Scrum process at a glance. We're going to dissect this throughout the next 10 minutes or so. If we were doing a class on Scrum, like a full 1 or 2 day class, we would really spend this, we would really be dissecting this during that whole entire time. So it's kind of a map, if you will, of the entire Scrum process. I'm going to be talking about the team, the events, and the artifacts of the Scrum process overall. So first, let's start with the team. A Scrum team consists of 5 to 9 people, which is 7 plus or minus 2 people. And we call that a 2-pizza team. So we're looking for a team that 2 pizzas would feed. And it consists of 3 roles. First is the product owner. And the product owner maximizes the value of the product and the work of the development team. There is one and only product owner on a Scrum team. And the product owner is in charge of what we call the product backlog, and we'll talk about the product backlog in a little bit. But that's a definition of the work of the team. The product owner prioritizes that backlog, and the product owner represents the needs of the broader organization, and the team gets the requirements solely from the product owner. Second, we have the Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master is responsible for making sure that the team understands and enacts the rules of Scrum, if you will. Ensures that all the interactions with the development team are only those that are helpful and that don't distract the team from its purpose. The Scrum Master serves both the product owner and the team, educates the organization that interacts with the team, facilitates the Scrum events, and a key call out here is that a Scrum Master is not the same role as a project manager from a traditional project methodology. It's more of a servant leader model that supports the whole team and does not actually lead the work of the team, but guides them in their use of Scrum. And then we have the development team, the third and final role of the Scrum team. The development team is, again, a self-organized team responsible for delivering the product. No one, not even the product owner nor the Scrum Master, is in charge of the development team, and there are no titles per se of development team members other than that of development team, of developer. Individuals do have specialties, but those specialties belong to the development team as a whole. Next, we'll talk about the sprints. All of the work within the Scrum occurs within what we call sprints, which are fixed duration, iterative, time box, I don't know what you call Uber events of 2 to 4 weeks each. There are some exceptions. I've heard of some 1-week sprints, but that's a very unique situation. But really, typically, we see them in 2 to 4 week sprints. And each team has a fixed sprint length, and it doesn't adjust from sprint to sprint. All work occurs within the sprints from design all the way through testing. And the outcome of each sprint is called an increment, which means an incremental production-ready portion of the product. Next, let's talk about the events and artifacts that occur within each sprint. We have Scrum events, also known as ceremonies, and we have artifacts, which are outcomes of those events. And it's in these events and artifacts that we inspect and adapt the overall process and the product. So I mentioned the product backlog when I talked about the role of the product owner. So let's understand the product backlog a little bit more. It's the backbone of the work of the overall Scrum team. And again, the product owner owns the product backlog and kind of the ordering of the work within it. It's refined over time with input from the stakeholders and the team, and it contains a detailed definition of the product specifications, which are typically expressed in what we call user stories, and you may have heard of user stories in other uses of requirement definition. It also includes the statements of value, acceptance criteria, and overall prioritization. That product backlog is the input into the first event that we'll talk about, which is called sprint planning. In sprint planning, product backlog items are input into the process. So the product backlog items that have been refined by the team and are the next highest priority for the team to be working on come into this process. The product owner selects product backlog items as candidates for the team for a given sprint. And then the team plans the work of that sprint and forms a commitment to deliver on those specific product backlog items. So in the sprint planning, we're trying to get down to the details of the work involved. So the outcome is a definition of tasks for those product backlog items that are going to be included in a given sprint. Next, we have sprint execution. Sprint execution is where the development team delivers the product. It's over the course of the sprint. The team meets daily to review the product and the tasks at hand for that day. Each team member states in the sprint stand-up what they completed the previous day and what it's working on the current day and any impediments that it has. And this is called the daily scrum. The team collaborates on the work throughout the sprint to deliver on this increment. So the sprint execution uses what we typically call as a task board, a Scrum task board, which provides full transparency about the work for everybody involved in the sprint. So it has the committed stories along the left in this particular example, and then it has the tasks to deliver on those stories, and those tasks are situated within the not started, in progress, and done columns according to the status of those tasks. So one by one, the team is moving tasks from not started to in progress and to done. So the team updates the task board as the work progresses, and the team also may choose to add and delete tasks as appropriate for its discovery of new information and insights throughout the course of the sprint. And then sprint wrap-up consists of a couple of events and one artifact. That we have the sprint review and the retrospective as two events. The sprint review is an event where the team demonstrates all the completed work of the sprint, and the increment is inspected according to the definition of done. And definition of done is basically ensuring that work meets the acceptance criteria of the product backlog item that the team is demonstrating. Any feedback collected during the sprint review results in potentially future product backlog items for the team to address. The team meets in what's also called a retrospective, in which it critically evaluates the process that the team went through in that previous sprint, what can be improved upon, and then to make plans for those improvements. So again, it's inspecting and adapting, part of that empirical process. So that's kind of an overview of Scrum concepts at a high level. I think what will be useful is for me here to hand over to Michael, and he's going to talk through some specific examples.
Welcome to the presentation today. Now we're going to go into kind of how we actually did this in real life, how some of the tools and some of kind of how the Scrum process ties back into some of the things you would normally expect in a typical project that you already are, have experienced in the past. One of the key things, the product backlog. First off, this can be thought of in a way as your project plan, if you will. Kind of a combined, it may even be a kind of a combined project plan and some of the documentation, because in each of the PBIs, each of the stories, you document the requirements, the assumptions, and basically what you're trying to get out of that story and what your, the final results will be, and that's considered the kind of your definition of done for that particular story. And each of those stories typically are in a 2-week, or should fall within the 2-week, and you'll typically have multiple stories that you're handling during that sprint in the 2 weeks. Probably about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 in our case. And each of those, you point each of those stories to kind of give you an idea of their relative size, and that way you can decide how many you need to take in. If you have a lot of very complex stories, in that case, you may have to break them into smaller pieces, but you'll typically have establish what you call a velocity, and that's the number of points that you're handling during every 2-week period. And by pointing all the stories, you're really figuring out how long you're going to end up taking for this project. You create the product backlog, and it helps you to establish how the size of the stories, and then you can, by just doing pretty simple math, figure out about how many sprints it'll require to complete that project. And that's part of kind of what happens with the product backlog. One important point is, though, is you start out at a high level, talking about different, much higher components, and that you break down into the story level. And we'll go into that a little bit later. I think Steve has a little bit on that. And then when you break them, as you break them down, you start building out this product backlog. You don't have it right up front. It's not like a traditional project where you would build out a whole project plan and build out the whole document, design document, and then move from there. You're building as you go. You're learning more about what your requirements are, and you're evolving this product backlog over time. But one of that, in a lot of ways, that actually helps you out get started right away. Some of our initial stories involve just integrations with other systems for data that we know we have to have, so we can get started on those before we ever even know what the final screens might look like that we're going to produce for the end user. Let's see. So then, and that kind of comes along with where you can group your PBIs and the haves, nice to haves, enhancements, etc. Because as you evolve this product backlog, of course, the user starts asking for some stuff that really isn't required to have that first round of the first release of the product. So those a lot of times start getting categorized in nice to haves and enhancements. Okay, the next slide we go into a little bit on one of the tools that we use to display it. This is shown in a tool called TFS. I don't remember what it stands for.
Team Foundation Services.
Yeah, Team Foundation Services. It's from Microsoft. There's a lot of different tools available. This is just one that, in all reality, we just started using this during this newest project. Prior to that, we used a spreadsheet, and a simple spreadsheet worked fine, and you can display the stories in a really nice one-page format that Steve had kind of worked up, and that worked just as well. But with having remote people, the online version actually has helped us, and we've all become accustomed to it and enjoy its a lot of its capabilities as well. But as you can see in here, the stories they're categorized as new, approved, committed, and done. The new ones are typically ones you've just created. You still need to, you haven't you had enough discussion on. You're still fleshing them out a little bit. The approved ones are ones you've already story pointed, but you're and are ready to go into a sprint and be assigned to a sprint. In this case, the committed ones are the ones that are in the sprint right then that you've committed to go ahead and completing during that sprint. And then, of course, the done ones are ones you've completed in prior sprints. But this is a good way to view the overall backlog. And in all reality, if you clicked on a different view, you'd have a very long list of stories that we have of PBIs. And this is just a zoomed-in version where you can actually do some color coding. In this case, we have spikes color-coded. They're something that we've kind of created as a small, very small story that in a lot of times is a precursor to one coming up. We know that we had a lot of issues working with outside teams just in prepping the data. An example is for them to create we have a publish and subscribe of the data, and for them to create their publish, they may already have one, but we have to interact with them to tell them, hey, these are the columns we need. This is the data we need from that the publish that you do. So they create one that's specific to ours. So this lets us kind of get a head start before we actually get into our story of building out receiving that data. Sometimes it's also just a fact-finding thing where you're going to go and actually discuss with an outside team a little bit of information that you need before you can really finalize some of the PBIs that you're working up. You might have a lot of questions on some, so you might set it up as a spike if it requires more than just a meeting or two. Usually this is when we're having to do kind of a design discussion and an analysis between maybe two options or something like that. And you want to kind of do a little more than just some phone calls and meetings. Okay. The next thing, again, as I discussed a little bit earlier, the backlog evolves throughout the whole project, and you gain so much by going ahead and get started on the things you can right up front while you're trying to evolve that backlog. And and again, it's pretty similar to what the project plan. It defines all the details of each of the individual pieces of work and what has to be done and what your output is. And in the case of TFS, you can assign, and we'll get into that in a second, task for even the quality assurance of those individual pieces. So you can actually use it to help document a little bit of what you went through in the evolution of your build. And the next slide again is some examples of exactly what our PBIs would typically look like. This was one of the challenges in our project, was trying to figure out how to break a story down into the appropriate size for 2 weeks. So some of the early examples are just setting up your environment, and that typically is working with another team here that in this case was doing they were doing some upgrade work. but it may be just gathering metadata, some things that you know you should be able to do early on in the project. The specific examples is we would break down pulling in some of the data and metadata into the relational database. They have subscribes for like location master that defines a lot of the store information, and so we can go ahead and pull that in and actually load it into DRM. So we might pull it in just to the relational database and prep it, and then actually in a different story move that metadata into DRM, and then possibly in a subsequent story then feed that data and metadata into S-Base and planning. So you're breaking those stories down instead of just trying to do from the beginning of taking in the data all the way through to loading it into S-Base. One of the big reasons we did this was because of the work required and upfront with the external teams. A lot of times we were very heavily dependent on them completing their work. So we didn't want to have our stories carried over because they weren't able to get it done. We wanted to give them time to get theirs done. Then we could go ahead and move forward and in a couple of different phases to get our stuff into S-Base. And then also in our case, we use ODI to help move things around. So in each of these areas, we had an ODI component where it might be just executing a pull from another system, or just a store procedure to move data into staging areas, for example, and then eventually, and in that process, do some validations. For example, if all the records didn't have a year and period that we needed, we can throw an email out and then let them know so they can go ahead and get the incoming data corrected, etc. All of that stuff are examples of different ways we broke down the PBIs to make them fit within our 2-week sprints. Okay, the sprint planning is one of the other keys that kind of feed off the product backlog. The product owners manage and is responsible for product backlog, and she's helping to he or she, in this case is she, Sue, is helping to manage the interaction with the client, helping them to kind of resolve and define what they really are looking for out of the product, out of what we're building, and put that into this backlog. And then as we come along for each of the sprints, she also is responsible for prioritizing what we need. What are we ready to do? What do we have all the pieces for? And what is the priority to keep this the timeline going and to make sure your critical path is always flowing correctly? So she's that's what goes into the sprint planning, her input into the sprint planning, and she brings into the meeting a list of the PBIs, and through that we discuss the actual PBIs themselves. We break those down into tasks, and then we actually agree to that. Yes, we're committing to this number of story points for this sprint, and kind of lock that in, and then kick off the sprint. So that's typically what occurs in the sprint planning. It's usually a meeting of a couple of hours long. And then next, the actual execution. This is the day-to-day I'm going to discuss, and we go through every day as we're working through that sprint, the 2-week sprint. In the morning, we have a daily Scrum meeting where we're about 15 minutes. We go through everybody in the team and ask them. They discuss kind of what they did. They moved. We try to move the tasks ahead of time, but they discuss what they moved from either into an in-progress state from the to-do, or from in progress to done, and then what they're going to take on, and then if they have any impediments that's keeping them from progressing, or that they foresee is going to become an issue down the road, so that we can discuss that. And you don't really go into details at that time for this daily stand-up. You would set up a tailgate topic, because right after that 15-minute stand-up, we'll have about a 30-minute tailgate opportunity. Sometimes it goes a little longer, a lot of times it's a lot shorter, and that's when you would really have the follow-on discussions at that time. and that's a key, because the communication is absolute priority. We were lucky in our first project here. We had a team room. We were all sitting in the room together, so you had a lot more informal time. You can discuss things, but if you don't have that team room, which we don't now, you really need to take advantage of this tailgate time and to really kind of set people up every day for success, and also for to make, especially the product owner and the Scrum Master, if you need some assistance with outside help from an external team, it helps them, get them the heads up, or to go back to the business to research some questions that you might have had, and they can take that on a lot of times and do that while you're still working. And this is an example kind of what you would have within TFS, and we actually used just Post-it notes on a board, and that was actually very successful. We all kind of missed when we got rid of the Post-it notes, because that was kind of just a tradition, and then went to this online version. But it did help, because communication when you're remote, or if you're flying home and you're working and you want to go ahead and move some things around, or check and make sure that what the next steps are, the tasks to do, or else just verifying, that, hey, you're meeting, the work you did that week, that you're on track to finish it, and that you're meeting what that specific story is expecting. Because sometimes, you really have to read the acceptance criteria, we call it, for that story, because you might think that it stops at one point in what you would expect the natural progression to be, but it might have stopped early. You might have already completed what's expected for this specific story this time, and the extra work that you're thinking of would come forward in the next story. But in this case, the yellow tags, they're color-coded by using some keywords like QA in the front, and then tech in the front, and the SME review. But that's kind of a plug-in this case for this specific tool in Google Chrome. Yeah. But it just helps you identify at a glance what to expect, because we know a lot of times the tech review is going to be done at the end, the SME review is going to be kind of done toward the end, and then but the tasks that we're typically working on are the yellow tasks. And I think there's one more. Yeah. So then to track the progress of it, we have using what was entered in on those tasks, because you change the hours. Each of those tasks, when you go through sprint planning, you're actually going to assign hours for every one of the tasks. And then, so this burn down chart shows the total number of hours that were in the tasks, all the tasks for all that stories in the sprint. And then as you go through the days, you'll actually start, reducing the number of hours left on each of the tasks. And then you see what hours are left as you go through the 2 weeks. And obviously, they show the ideal trend. Usually it doesn't work out that way. A lot of times the initial day or two, you kind of are fairly flat, because you're getting started on it. You're verifying you've got what you need. You may get started and do a few hours on a couple of the tasks and just don't have them quite done yet. And then, but it's just kind of it's typical. It's just kind of just you're pushing that snowball down the top of the hill, and it just gains momentum. And then, and this one is an example again where at the beginning of the sprint we identified there were some additional tasks that were probably left out or that were needed, so that's why it went up. And then as you then go down and work through it, you might also see a giant drop down if you decide to cancel a story or something like that. And then I think the next slide shows a little bit of whenever your Scrum Master's having fun with you when you're not doing your work quite as fast as you would, as he kind of hopes. So it's kind of pushing you along. And then this one is an example how in TFS and again, this is just one of many tools out there, but one that we just started using. But you can tie your actual test plans and test cases to a story. So the QA person can start building out the various test plans at the beginning of the sprint, and also you can work with them as a developer and make sure they're capturing all the things that do need to be tested. And testing's been a challenge for us in the sprints, and we're still kind of evolving on that process, trying to get the work work to the QA person early, so they don't end up with a lot of it having to do at the very end of the sprint. But this definitely helps by organizing a lot of it. I believe the next slide shows you test cases, one of those, and it tells you the details and what the results and all that. So you can get pretty detailed and capture a lot of information, attachments, and all that kind of stuff in there as well. So yeah, so the test cases are, themselves broken down into steps here. And that's, again, just one of the advantages of having a good tool beyond just doing Post-it notes. So in the next slide, I think we're moving on to back to Steve, so you can talk about their actual Scrum journey at Starbucks.
So that was just, thank you, Michael. That was just a bit of insight into how we use different Scrum tools to follow the Scrum process overall. Now I want to take a bit of a step back and share with you a bit about our journey at Starbucks in adopting Agile practices, Scrum being the primary of them for us. Starbucks being a very dynamic organization with a high rate of business growth, high degree of business change, and also a culture that's very kind of face-to-face, high-touch oriented. Agile was a hand-in-hand fit for us to achieve better results in our project delivery. Scrum, in particular, enables us to have a rapidly changing business and be able to respond to those business changes. Since we're working incrementally, we're learning along the way. We're reviewing the outcomes of sprints. We're adapting the process and the product, and we're moving forward, and that allows us to be agile with a changing business. It also invites high degree of customer face-to-face interaction and kind of a tangible, hands-on approach to the product from a customer perspective, which works really well with our high-touch, face-to-face organization. Thinking incrementally also helps us simplify the solution by bringing things down to a sprint level or increment level. I want to talk to you a little bit about two projects in particular. Michael has referenced examples from a couple of them. Our first project where we implemented Scrum within the EPM space was a project to deliver a financial reporting solution. It was an excellent fit for Scrum because we had a baseline application to start with. We were looking to enhance and automate the controls and processes around the application that supports our financial reporting business process. There was a high level of engagement with the business stakeholders. It included a new application also to provide valuable reporting to our licensed store business. And also, we were able to really kind of begin to exercise Scrum tools. And as Michael mentioned, when we started off with the most basic of Scrum tools. We started off with Excel and a cardboard wall with Post-its. And we did all of our planning and execution and management of the sprints within those tool sets. And it actually was quite effective. We went on to our next project and evolved our Scrum processes a bit. But this project was specifically to support some store development activities. So we have all of our store development business, the construction managers and construction teams and the business leadership overseeing kind of all the real estate process all the way through construction and remodeling. We're building a solution to support the planning and budgeting of those capital projects. It's a significant technology improvement from what they currently have today, and we're going to be supporting over 500 total users with an S-based planning and reporting solution. But we graduated our tool set within this project, and we're now kind of, I would say, about midway on this project. As Michael showed you, we're using Team Foundation Server for managing our product backlog, for managing the sprint backlog with the tasks, and doing our reporting. And Michael showed you some examples of the burn down charts, and burn down charts are a way of just showing how we're progressing through the course of a sprint or a release. So getting to where we could be effective with Scrum in our organization took some effort from an organization perspective. We started off each project with what we call Sprint Zero. Sprint Zero isn't specifically prescribed by Scrum, but it is a common kind of best practice to essentially get the work ready for the team and to get the team ready for the work. As we get the work ready for the team, we had a series of facilitated working sessions to build the product backlog, define value, to understand the measurable business objectives we want to achieve by the product, and then to be able to associate the product backlog items against achieving those objectives. We defined the backlog according to 7 dimensions, such as data, interactions, user interface, controls, quality, and so forth. Our initial product backlog had items in it that were very big and high level. We call those big stories, we call those epics, because they haven't been broken down into small enough pieces to be brought into sprints yet. So they're at what we call the epic level. So we decompose those epics into smaller product backlog items or user stories, and then we prioritize those product backlog items. And again, that's the product owner that's driving that process. And then we work with the development team to refine the product backlog item. So the development team has questions about how they're going to approach a given product backlog item. That discussion with the business and with the product owner and amongst the team results in a refined product backlog item that the team can then bring into a sprint. So we also got the team ready for the project by first of all assembling the right team members. So understanding what the skill set requirements were going to be for the full team. Conducting Scrum training. And we also did a team liftoff, which is really essential for the team to establish kind of its working practices, how it's going to work together, what's going to make them successful as a team, and they developed what's called the team charter. And then we also made sure that we have all the tools and resources that we needed to start the work. And then we begin sprint 1. I mentioned earlier about, actually Michael did as well, talked about how the product backlog serves as the overall, essentially the equivalent of a project plan. The product backlog is the definition of the work, the value, the order and priority of that work, the acceptance criteria, and so forth. Each product backlog item is given an estimate of size according to what Michael referred to as story points. And these are kind of arbitrary, it's an arbitrary numbering sequence, meaning that it doesn't associate any specific level of effort in terms of hour units or days or weeks or whatever. It's really just a relative size of each backlog item. So smaller items might be a 1, 2, or 3. Medium sizes might be a 5, 8, or a 13. Larger ones might be a 20 or a 40. And it's using a numbering sequence that's common within Scrum practices. So we're able to associate this sizing technique against our initial product backlog to understand, based upon a typical, what we think is a standard velocity assumption for this team, to be able to then say, here's an initial projection of what we think it's going to take to complete this project from a time and cost perspective. Because although we are doing Agile, we're remaining true to our Agile principles, we exist in an organization that requires a funded project, requires an understanding of when things will be delivered so that the organization at large can anticipate that and be ready for it. Okay, where are we? All right. And some of our challenges with Scrum we thought we want to share with you, because these are not unique to us. These are typical challenges that we see in the industry as practitioners embrace Agile approaches. Like most teams new to Agile, we're evolving and growing, and we still are to this day, even though we're midway through our second project, effectively using Scrum within the EPM space. But we have had some challenges getting those product backlog items decomposed from the bigger epics down to small enough sizes that can be brought into a sprint and completed within a given sprint. We have a very ambitious team that wants to accomplish a lot. So getting sprint commitments that are right-sized for what the team can deliver within a given 2 weeks increment has been a challenge. Also, because we have a variety of skill sets within the team, it's common for a lot of different work to get started out of the gate. But what we need to do is minimize work in progress so that we get individual product backlog items quickly to the done state. And that also helps address the next problem that also Michael had alluded to, which is getting our quality assurance activities within a sprint engaged early so that we're not bunching that up at the very tail end of the sprint. And lastly, completing the final pieces of each product backlog item. Because even though we're doing Agile, we still need to inspect code. We still need to document those kind of non-sexy things that are essential and still part of the acceptance criteria and the definition of done for those product backlog items. Those also tend to pile up at the tail end. So all these kind of dynamics kind of go hand in hand. We're trying to get work moved quickly from to do to in progress to done so that we can complete all those steps across all product backlog items within the sprint. So when thinking about how you might embrace Agile, embrace Scrum in your organization, I think there are some key factors that I want to share with you. First of all, there needs to be a commitment from an organizational culture perspective to Scrum. A team will not likely be very effective if they're working in isolation and not educating leadership and getting leadership buy-in into the Scrum process. That was key for Starbucks. We've had a kind of a revolution of project culture in orienting around Agile practices. Also, team culture is key because Scrum is easy to learn, but it's difficult to master. And the teams need to be willing to change. And oftentimes we have teams that are comprised of professionals that have been delivering solutions for decades, and changing practices and mindset around Scrum is a challenging shift. Agile coaching is huge in all of this. Agile coaches are practitioners in the industry that exist around the globe. We found them to be extremely helpful in building our Agile culture and also coaching individual teams and coming up to speed in Agile. I also believe in starting small and learning from those experiences. So don't go wild with multiple teams working on a Scrum approach all at one time. Start with one team and learn from that experience and grow from there. Also, really fully commit to doing Scrum. The failures that we know of around us in delivering Scrum typically are cases where people have made compromises and not fully embraced Scrum. And in those cases, it's really not the fault of Scrum that those failures occur. What we see is it's the fault of the implementation. So it's important that we start fresh with and do our best to really preserve the principles of Scrum, which are not very rigid. Actually, they're principles, but there are many practices that can adapt to the needs of a given organization and project culture. And lastly, just realize that Agile and Scrum is a journey, and it takes time to become fluent and feel comfortable in it. All right, so we've given you a definition of Scrum and the principles of the events, artifacts, and the team. We've given you some examples and talked a bit about how we've implemented Scrum here at Starbucks and kind of the practices of making it successful within our organization. So now I'd like to open up to any questions you may have.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions already, but before I read them off, I just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have questions for the presenters, just go ahead and type them in the questions box and we'll read them off and answer them. So the first question is, what is the best way to get started using Scrum Agile on a project?
Excellent question. So that's a good kind of summary recap of kind of the overall message here today. I'll start off by saying, and Michael, feel free to jump in, that it's important to become educated and aware of just what you're doing today. Become educated and aware of the approach in general, and what are some of the challenges are that people in the industry have encountered in bringing Scrum into their organizations. And I would say start with conversations. It needs to be kind of an organic embracing of the principles of Scrum. Again, the leadership commitment to it is key, and then getting the right coaching to start off correctly. So oftentimes I've seen teams that have kind of gotten the signal, hey, Agile would be really good for us, and they rush into it, and they have not adequately prepared, and they hit the pitfalls and mistakes that a lot of teams have encountered. So kind of really starting methodically from the beginning with good training, education, and coaching, and that's from leadership all the way down to the project team.
Yeah, I think as a team member, it was important for me to really learn kind of and to figure out how to adapt what I would have expected to happen during like a sprint to break it down and fit in what I can actually get done in a sprint was one of the challenges. And when I first came on board, some of the processes, breaking things down into tasks, a lot of those things you really have to do in a regular project anyway. So if you really kind of sit back and look at what's being done in Scrum, a lot of it is really exists in the real project world anyway, because you're trying to get things into 2-week increments for a project plan. It's ideal, 2-week or smaller. And then whenever you're breaking down for the individual worker, you really want to break them down into basically, if you could, daily sized tasks, or and also just giving you that chance as a developer to break the things down to where you get the work done. But so all of that really is sitting there in this framework. I think one of the big things they did here is in kind of adapting to Scrum and Agile, is they created what they called Sprint Zero, which is kind of unique here, but it's there may be some other places that obviously use it, because you kind of need it to help to establish the initial part of the product backlog. And what takes place there is you're breaking the entire project down into very large chunks of work. They're called epics, and then you break them down a little further, and then eventually you break them down. You start breaking them down to stories, and your stories even then might be still larger than a 20-point story. So then you just continue to refine it and break it down. But that initial kickoff helps to really kind of flesh out what you're going to need and kind of drive that product owner to decide here's where we need to focus on and break down first, being a lot of times data integrations and things like that. Also working with the users to define kind of what is the end product going to look like to some degree, so that they can everybody can start looking into, is there anything else we need? Can our technology handle exactly what they're asking for and things like that? But I think one of the big things also that Steve mentioned was coaching. I think that's been critical, and having an established Scrum Master with some experience. If you don't have experience, you definitely want the coaching there, because they can help make sure that you're filling your roles and you're not going outside of your roles, because that's also a key. The Scrum Master's not there to be a project manager. He's there to manage a lot of the actual just Scrum processes and help the team to do what they need to do during those ceremonies, as they call them.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, the next question is, what kind of support organization does Starbucks have for Scrum Agile?
Excellent question. Yeah, we do have a central organization that is responsible as a whole for the overall capabilities and competency of the Starbucks technology organization. So it includes every aspect of training and development of our competencies. Within that group, centrally located within technology, there is an Agile practices group that is comprised of coaches and folks that are establishing common best practices, creating kind of organic, again, grassroots kind of feel, if you will, of Agile practitioners that are learning from each other and growing together. And as part of that, there's a group called the Agile Working Group, and I'm a member of that group, which consists of folks outside of that central organization that are the practitioners that are trying to establish overall fluency in Agile across the organization. And what we do is we go visit teams, and we conduct what's called a fluency assessment, which is really a team's opportunity to assess itself and evaluate how well it's doing in adopting Agile. And we collect those results from those teams that do those. We facilitate those sessions, but then we collect the results so that we can share with leadership overall. Here are the things that are challenging across teams. We have some 40 Agile teams within technology alone. So we bring this kind of to an aggregate level and say, here are some common themes that we're seeing as we meet with these teams, and here are what their challenges are and what their successes are. And here are some recommendations that we have for the organization as a whole. And there's a steering committee of top leaders that are looking at Agile adoption and takes that input from the Agile Working Group and implements those changes across, I don't want to say changes specifically for the teams, but to our culture, to our organization, that allows those teams to be more successful and to thrive.
Yeah, one of the things that helped us a lot on that first project really was the commitment here at Starbucks to doing this. And in our case, having a room together, we were all co-located, and we were lucky to have a room. You don't have to have a room right now. In this case, we actually are in all of our cubes are together, and we actually have a little some areas that you can have little breakout sessions in. But having that room helped us, especially I think for the people that were new to the process. You're surrounded by a lot of the documents and a lot of just the work product. You had whiteboards that you didn't have to worry about, other people erasing stuff off of, and you could keep up just critical things that, obviously you could have taken a picture, printed, or something like that. But I think that helped us a lot. Also, the making sure that you had the right team members, having people that can pick up and what we call swarm at the end of a sprint. If you have especially your primary stories you need to get done in that sprint, critical path things, you want people that have some skills that are can cover multiple areas, so they can pick up some of their tasks on those stories. We have a challenge here, and then I have the deepest relational database skills, and we didn't really have many people that had some of those skills. So a lot of times I was a critical path early in sprints to get things going, and that just made my priorities make sure, you know, I would spread them across a lot of the stories, and it made my work a little more challenging for me in the end. But you know, you work through it. But if you have vacations and things, that's a challenge for the product owner to schedule her, you know, the stories for each of the sprints to make sure that you have the skill set on hand. Now we have some additional people on hand that can pick up various pieces of it, you know, whenever I'm not here. So it helps out to really make sure that your team, you know, is built and put together correctly, I think, and that's what another one of the parts of the organization has to kind of support.
Yep. Indeed.
Great. Okay, so the next question is a bit of a setup. I recently obtained my PMP certification and hope to move into project management from financial systems and EPM. Scrum seems very different from the 47 processes that are stressed in project management. In what circumstances or in what type of organizational culture would you use Scrum versus following the project management protocol?
Yep. Another very, very good question, because Starbucks has really grappled with this all along, and we still today do, because we, though we have a strong now presence of Agile approaches, we also have a number of, it still makes sense for us to continue with traditional Waterfall project approaches. In fact, even within my program, we have one in particular. So I'll use this as an example of where I think a choice for traditional Waterfall and project management approaches would be favored over Agile. We're doing an upgrade of our entire EPM suite, and that process is very phase-driven, which is we stand up one environment, we do all the installations, and we do a regression test of everything. We gather all the things that broke out of that process, and then we repeat it with our certification environment, then we repeat it again with our production environment before we go to production. So it was very kind of Waterfall by its just definition of that overall approach. That was the best practice for this particular implementation. We could have chosen to do an Agile approach because there is iterations there, but it would have been kind of a square peg round hole kind of fit for that work with respect to the upgrade itself. So we made a decision in that case to follow a traditional Waterfall approach, which has worked really, really well for that project. So that's an example of it. I would say where we really find our most elegant fit of Scrum to project objectives is when you have an established product and you're looking to evolve it or enhance it or enrich it or improve it in some way. It works very well when you have a incremental delivery alignment with your business, and the business can accept incremental changes to the product over a period of time. And the beauty of this is that with Agile, we can do this quickly and we can deliver value early and often. So again, with Starbucks being a dynamic changing culture, by the time we start a long Waterfall project, by the time we get to the end, the organization can be entirely different. We may have developed a set of features and aspects of the product that don't align any longer to the current needs of the business. So Agile allows us to stay trued up to the current driving factors that are going to make the difference in terms of value to the business.
Great. And then looks like the last question we have is, what kind of training do you recommend?
Okay, excellent question. Here in Seattle, we have a local training organization that has really done the bulk of our Agile training, and that's Constructs, and that's I believe it's Steve McConnell's organization, and they are specifically kind of a technology practices training organization. There are other ones out there. I recommend starting with going to scrum.org, and scrum.org is a website that is part of the scrum.org organization. We use some of their material by permission in today's presentation, and at that website there is a Scrum guide. There's a link to the current latest Scrum guide, which is actually quick reading, so I highly recommend you go there and read through the Scrum guide to get kind of oriented in Scrum in a little more detail than we were able to go through today, but it'll kind of reiterate a lot of the practices and principles that we talked about, but it'll go a little bit more in depth. There's also some great reading out there, and if anybody's interested, I could be happy to share a book or two that I've used within Starbucks that we use together here to help build our practice and build our fluency. And thirdly, going back to those training organizations, we put our teams through a 2 to 3 day Scrum training process. So when a new team is forming, and we have people that are new to Agile and Scrum in particular, even sometimes ones that have been through it before, we like to send as a refresher. We send them as a whole team to this boot camp, 2 to 3 day immersion in Scrum processes. And that's everybody from the product owner, the Scrum Master, the full development team, sometimes even some of the management team around that team, so that they can be aware of and support the needs of that team as well.
Okay, it looks like we do have one more question. How are budgets determined for these projects?
Okay, that's definitely a challenge in Agile, because within an Agile approach, you're inspecting and adapting, and the customers oftentimes learning what their needs are as the product is evolving. So what we do within Agile is we take a basis for the product backlog, and what we did for this particular couple of projects that we talked about today was we took our high-level product backlog that we developed early on in the project, and we were able to associate story points at a high level to those product backlog items, and then use a standard assumption of velocity. Velocity is the amount of story points that a Scrum team can deliver within a single sprint, and that velocity typically evolves over the first, I'll say, 3 to 7 sprints, depending upon how that team is ramping up. And when we get to about that 3 to 7 sprint point, somewhere in there where we feel like we're stabilizing velocity, we're getting some consistency, we now have a product backlog that is fully defined. It may not be defined down to the lowest level of detail. We may not have decomposed all those epics into small user stories yet, but we still have all the features kind of articulated in there. We can begin to create a forecast of how many story points it's going to take to complete the project, to deliver the product as we understand it today. But it's important to footnote on that with Agile, we don't want to translate that to a commitment. We don't want to translate that to say we understand all of our requirements, all of our features, all of our designs and whatnot, because those need to evolve as we learn. So what we are able to do, though, is be able to say, based upon what we know today, here's what we project the product backlog completion to take in terms of story points, which we can then translate to time, using velocity as a measure. And we use that then to translate, so if we know how long it's going to take us, we know who our team are, we can take all the costs of the project, maybe some even non-team costs like software costs, infrastructure costs, travel, those kinds of things that kind of go into a typical project, and we can put together an overall project budget.
Great. Okay, well, I think we've got all the questions that have come through. So unless you or Michael have anything else to add, we'll go ahead and conclude today's broadcast.
Well, I just want to thank you for coming and spending the time with us and letting us kind of enlighten you on Scrum and Agile. It's been definitely, as a developer, an interesting journey, and I've enjoyed it quite a bit. I know sometimes people have a little bit of heartache when they're going through it, but a lot of times if you just embrace it and try to look at how you can fit within the Scrum and Agile framework, and working with the Scrum Master, you've got a lot of coaches and they can answer a lot of questions and help you through a lot of it, because it's not a brand new thing. People have been out there doing it for a while, so usually your questions have been asked many times before. So work through it and ask the questions, and try to embrace it as much as you can, because that's, I think, the best way to really thrive doing it and actually succeed at it. Steve?
Yep, I echo everything Michael just said. We do appreciate your time today, and it's fun as we're learning to be able to share our learnings with others, because we think that this is a real big opportunity to revolutionize project delivery approaches. And Starbucks is one that likes to learn and share and grow and learn from others. So we just want to continue doing that and continue to do things like the case scope presentation and these webinars and whatnot. And it's just a way for us to refine our own skills. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael and Steve. Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.